Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à cet forum pour notre concert suivant, le 30 mars. Et le sujet, c'est les quatre saisons. Il y a bien des compositeurs qui étaient inspirés par la nature pendant toute l'histoire. Et nous allons jouer de la musique vraiment que, si ce n'est pas exactement dédié à les quatre saisons, qui a une inspiration de la nature. J'ai avec moi Boulianne, qui est une merveilleuse chanteuse, qui est notre soliste, et aussi Marc Djokic, qui est notre violon solo et qui sera aussi notre soliste aujourd'hui pour ce concert, je dois dire. Et le compositeur très connu au Canada, Croall, qui est de l'origine Odawan. Est-ce qu'on dit ça? Comme Première Nation. So, welcome everyone. I have three wonderful guests today. Julie Boulianne, who is our soloist, vocal soloist, Marc Djokic, who's our concertmaster, and also our soloist on this occasion, and composer Barbara Croall, who is a First Nations composer using her first language being Ottawan. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Well, we say Anishinaabe-Moan, and we have three languages in my community: Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, or Godawatami.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, perhaps I should start out with our composer. If I could ask you to describe the work that we're going to play and talk a little bit about what we should look for in it that will particularly inspire us.
Well, it's an interesting coincidence when you asked me to write a piece and featuring Julie, which I was really excited about. Beautiful voice. I love mezzo-soprano voice. And also to feature the flute and strings. And I was thinking about a place in my childhood, a lake where I used to swim a lot, right through my teen years into adult years. And it's on Manitoba-Nising, Manitoulin Island, where my family's from and I'm still based. And there's an island in the middle of the lake. And we've always known of her as Mindamoya, which means old woman. And there were a lot of stories about her passed down. When the settlers came to our island, they renamed the island Treasure Island, however. And some of the original stories about her lost. And my auntie, who passed away a long time ago, would tell me about her when I was out swimming, because it actually looks like a woman lying down sleeping in the water. And it has a really beautiful, calm presence because the lake is very shallow. You can practically walk out for a long period of time without it being very deep, and the water's warm because of that. And it tends to be very calm. And it just has this presence of her, of this beautiful old woman who is like a guardian spirit. So I decided to base the piece on this, but during the coming of winter when the water starts to freeze up. And the flute is kind of a transformative figure that serenades her to sleep. And she's going into her deep sleep for the winter. And the bird transforms sometimes, especially at the end, into an owl. And that's when the singer also does a screech owl call. That's the kind of sound you hear in the early winter, because that's when the screech owls actually mate, not in the spring but in the winter. So you hear all these beautiful calls when the snow is all fresh on the lake and on the ground. And yeah, so that was the inspiration for the piece. And I have a really nice photo of the island too, that people can look at and be inspired by.
Vous devez me donner cette photographe parce que je peux le faire montrer pendant la captation de ce programme. Barbara vient de nous décrire une île dans le lac où elle est née qui est dans je ne sais, dans la forme d'une femme et qui était l'inspiration de cette œuvre. Maintenant, je dois vous demander, Julie, qu'est-ce que vous avez trouvé dans cette œuvre et aussi parlez-nous un peu de le langage parce que vous savez, moi je trouve que je sais aujourd'hui tout le monde c'est une monde uni, mais autrefois on parlait, spécialement dans la musique, de différentes régions du monde, de différents langages, si c'est français, si c'est italien, si c'est espagnol, des langages européens, mais aussi ici en Amérique, nous avons plusieurs, comme Barbara décrivait, plusieurs langues avant que les Européens viennent ici et ils ont tous leur caractère individuel. Alors, parlez-nous un peu du défi, premièrement, parce que c'est un défi toujours de chanter dans des différentes langues, que ce soit européenne ou nord-américaine. Que trouvez-vous dans cette œuvre comme inspiration langage?
D'abord, j'aimerais dire que euh, aborder une nouvelle langue, c'est toujours comme une micro-immersion dans une nouvelle culture aussi. Hein. C'est pas seulement la langue, c'est pas seulement les mots. Tout se mélange en fait. Dans le cas de cette œuvre-là, c'est particulier, c'est un peu comme la fois où avant cette œuvre-là, j'avais pas beaucoup touché aux langues complètement étrangères, c'est-à-dire qui sont pas latines, qui sont pas européennes, qui sont pas... je veux dire, même avec les langues slaves, on a quand même plus de notions.
Peut-être pas hongrois.
Ouais, je dois dire que même j'ai chanté en polonais. Une fois, j'ai enregistré des trucs en polonais. Ça, je trouvais ça un petit peu difficile. Mais bon, avant ça, j'avais fait un truc en mandarin aussi. Ça, j'avais trouvé ça... c'était un défi. Mais là, dans ce cas-ci, j'ai eu la chance, en fait, d'avoir Barbara qui m'a beaucoup aidée, qui m'a beaucoup... elle m'a fait un enregistrement du texte et du poème et c'était magnifique. En fait, l'entendre parler, c'est absolument fabuleux. Puis ça m'a donné toutes les couleurs qu'il fallait pour aborder la pièce musicalement. C'était comme la clé qui manquait. Là. Il fallait vraiment que je l'entende parler, le truc. Mais ça a été long de maîtriser les subtilités des voyelles. Parce que même si c'est écrit, bon, plus ou moins en phonétique, comme je suis capable de comprendre, il y a quand même des petites subtilités. Et là, c'est là que tu es content d'avoir ton entraînement de chanteur parce qu'on a quand même une oreille qui est plus exercée, ouais, raffinée pour détecter les subtilités et puis les accents toniques aussi et tout. Après, je pense que le défi, c'est pas tant d'avoir le langage correct, mais c'est comment je dirais, de vivre de faire vivre le texte émotionnellement, émotivement dans la musique. Et quand c'est pas ta langue maternelle et quand c'est une langue qui est complètement étrangère, c'est difficile de vraiment avoir cette connexion-là. Le corps, le cerveau, ça ne gère pas les informations de la même façon. Donc, moi, ce que je fais souvent, c'est que je prends la phrase et puis à chaque phrase et surtout avec les mots importants, je prends des mots importants dans la phrase et je mets des images. Je dois mettre des images. Je fonctionne avec des images.
Julie was talking about sort of physical images, visual images that are created in a sense by the language or that help her in being able to sing in the language accurately. And in this instance, she was talking about Barbara having provided her with a recording of Barbara actually singing that language and speaking it as she does, of course, very fluently because it's her natural language. I think I'm always impressed for my own sake in that when I hear music written by people of different languages, where that's their native language, that music has a character that's similar to the speech, to the spoken word. The music itself is imbued with that character. when you think of French music, you think, obviously, I think always of Impressionism, because French Impressionism is characteristic of the fluidity of the French language. And one of the interesting things for me of the Odawan language is that it has a subtlety that it's difficult for us to hear and to reproduce, but it also is very mellifluous, if I can use such a word in English. It has a fluidity and a beauty all its own. It's quite musical.
There's a calmness. Il y a comme c'est ça, ouais, fluidité. Et c'est très calme comme langage.
Yes.
C'est très apaisant, en fait.
Yes.
Ouais.
And when you hear, of course, that this piece is influenced by an island that's in a lake, I mean, it gives you an idea of the language and it gives you a mental picture.
Ouais. Et en fait, c'est tellement la pièce est tellement bien écrite, bien composée, et le texte est tellement descriptif, ça y va tout seul. Ça a été super naturel comme.
Yes, and I think listeners will find something very attractive in allowing their mind to simply, think about an island in the middle of a northern lake, perhaps shaped in the often words or images help us to understand what the composer had in intention. Now, it's not always that composers intend to describe anything at all. I mean, often composers simply write music for music's own sake. And then we often, as interpreters, have to develop our own images to make that music, de faire en sortir l'esprit de cette musique. Et des fois, plutôt les compositeurs ne mettent pas des images dans la musique. Et ça vous donne, c'est seulement une composition, des sonorités, il n'y a pas d'histoire, il n'y a pas de caractère, il n'y a rien de décrire, sauf la musique, et on doit trouver comme interprète les images pour interpréter la musique. One of the composers, two of the composers, in addition to Barbara, are Baroque composers. Well, I should say one is Baroque composer, Antonio Vivaldi. And Vivaldi was unusual in that he provided probably the very first example of program music that we have in history. Il a écrit ces 4 saisons qui sont vraiment célèbres pour ces jeunes filles de son école à Venise, une école pour les jeunes filles où il enseignait. Et il a vraiment fait toute une je ne sais pas, une culture de cet orchestre. Et cette musique très, très célèbre, les 4 saisons de Vivaldi, ont inspiré toutes sortes de compositeurs. Marc Djokic est avec nous, c'est lui le soliste. Peut-être vous pouvez nous décrire un peu l'inspiration de Vivaldi et comment ça vous inspire comme musicien.
Just to brush up on my French here, you're asking me what is my inspiration for playing Vivaldi?
Yes, what's your inspiration in interpreting the 4 seasons? And I should say in English that one of the interesting things about these 4 seasons is that Vivaldi writes into the music itself a description of every effect, every musical phrase that what we're supposed to hear in the music itself. It's very, what I call in language, onomatopoeic. In other words, people may not know what that word is, even in English. It's a word that describes a sound. Crunching, for example, that's onomatopoeic because you can hear the crr in the crunching, and that describes the sound. So that is very helpful to us. How does that sort of help inspire you as a musician?
Well, Boris, although I will speak, I'd rather hear you talk about it because you did such a wonderful job reading the sonnets during the concert we did last summer at the Brott Festival. And you did such a wonderful job of those readings, but I'll try to give kind of a personal account of how I feel about the 4 seasons. And I'll start off with a little story, actually. It's kind of a funny story I tend to tell when I play the music of Vivaldi. I actually had the opportunity to perform in Venice, and I went to actually play a little bit at the La Pieta, where he had to taught the girls at the orphanage, and I got to do a little sightseeing around there, and the tour guide actually showed me Vivaldi's organ, which is still there. And the group that I was with was actually admiring the organ, looking at it, even touching the keys. And because I'm very in touch with all my senses, I decided it would be an interesting idea to look inside behind where the pipes were. And while I was there, I actually decided to stick my head in a little further and smell the inside of the organ. And how many people can say that they've smelled the inside of Vivaldi's organ? So that is me, and I still remember what it smelled like. Kind of woodsy smell, a little musty, a little damp, you know, that's Venice, but I'll always remember that. So that's kind of one of those other senses I have that I took for me from Vienna, is the smell of Vivaldi's organ. But when playing his music, you know, I think it's really, you know, just moving, the fact that he, you know, has so much imagery in his writing for back then. I mean, it really it really kind of speaks to people, because I mean, you know, in most places in the world, people have experience, or a lot of places in the world, people have experienced four seasons. So you know, and kind of in the sonnets, you can kind of get a taste of what he's describing. But you know, everybody can relate. I think that's why it's such a huge success. And when playing the Four Seasons, you know, it's really fun to kind of, you know, have such drastic changes of color. You know, I'm not sure how people played it back during his time, or how violinists have played it over the years, but it's amazing just how much imagery you can create on your instruments. So anything from you know, the sound of sort of the drunkard that he's portraying, or you know, the cries of the dogs, or things like that. You know, it's that kind of imagery that I find it very inspiring as a violinist to try to communicate in the music.
Maintenant, une autre pièce que nous allons jouer, on va faire toutes les quatre saisons de Piazzolla, d'Astor Piazzolla. Astor Piazzolla est devenu un compositeur vraiment très célèbre de nos jours-ci. Je pense aussi parce qu'il sait comment décrire la musique dans une façon originale et dans une façon dansant, et dansant dans une manière argentinienne. Le tango, évidemment, c'est une danse célèbre qui en Amérique du Sud, but no more so than the dances that Vivaldi himself described within his Four Seasons, because a lot of music, of Baroque music, had to do with the courts of that period of time and was based on dances, much like a lot of our music going from Baroque right straight through to Romantic to contemporary music. Perhaps in contemporary music, we've lost a lot of this sense of the dance. Maybe that's because we don't dance that often, or that the dance is more rock and roll and popular dances that is very difficult to incorporate within classical music. So, or maybe we're just not inspired enough by that music. I'm not exactly sure why, but it seems that I find very few composers in the sense of pop music or our contemporary music use dance forms and dance forms of our day. But Piazzolla really incorporates, what's interesting about these Four Seasons by Piazzolla is that he incorporates into this tango feel many of Vivaldi's own music. So we hear quotations within this tango framework of that echo back to the 18th, 17th century of Vivaldi. Did I get this right? Is Vivaldi 17th or 18th century? I never can figure it out which is which. Anyway, so I asked Marc to perhaps bring his violin, since he's in his studio at home, and perhaps play for us some of those excerpts.
Just had to unmute here. Yeah, I'm gonna play some excerpts from from the Piazzolla Four Seasons. And the version, it's worth mentioning that the version that we're playing of Piazzolla's Four Seasons is not the version that he would have done exactly with his quintet. This is actually an arrangement made by a Russian composer, probably not saying it right, Leonid Desyatnikov. I have a hard name to pronounce, so I have no excuse to butcher this name. But and it's actually
Desnatikov.
Yeah, okay.
It's my Russian background.
There you go. There you go. So yeah, and he actually he arranged this Four Seasons, and he actually filled in some quotations from Vivaldi. Piazzolla didn't do that, so this is actually quite a different arrangement from Piazzolla's original version with his quintet. And I think it's really neat that he did this, because there's been other versions of the Four Seasons. For example, Philip Glass did a version, which I actually really like, but he really made no quotes to the original Vivaldi Four Seasons.
But this was his inspiration. C'était son inspiration lui-même en parlant des Quatre Saisons.
Right. Actually, if you could talk for like one more minute, I'm going to grab my violin in back of me. I'm actually, interesting enough, the violin I'll be playing on for this concert would have been used in Vivaldi's time, because it is a Peter Guarnerius of Venice, made in 1740. So that it's interesting that the instrument I'm using kind of ties in.
So that would be 18th century.
18th century, yeah.
Yes.
So it'll be kind of tying in, playing Piazzolla on it, although it's an instrument from Vivaldi's time, I think is kind of appropriate and really interesting. And, rarely do I ever choose a violin based on the music I'm playing. I usually do it for fun. But for this particular concert, I thought it would be a really good idea, and I'm kind of glad I did it. So I'm going to go grab that very violin. Give me 2 seconds.
Good. Well, I'll ask Julie. Julie, you are also going to sing another piece by another Indigenous Canadian composer by the name of Thompson Highway, who has a classical training. And this piece is very much evidence of a classical training, but he writes very little for orchestra. So we had to have this orchestrated in order for you to sing it. Talk to me a little bit about his ode to a rose.
Well, it was the challenge for this piece was to make it work for in a more lyrical way, because the original version is more of a jazz setting.
Yes, of course.
Yes, but we have a beautiful orchestration by
François Vallière.
Yeah, and it works very well, and I'm very happy about it.
Il est notre orchestrateur en résidence.
And it also, and it also, it's funny because it sort of pictures seasons of life in a way as well, because it talks about the rose who blooms, breathes, and fades away, So
c'est une réflexion de la vie, évidemment.
Exactement.
Et je pense que la musique, plusieurs musiques vraiment décrit d'une façon ou une autre notre vie, et même l'idée des quatre saisons, c'est l'idée de notre vie, le printemps de notre vie, notre jeunesse, l'été et l'automne de notre vie, et finalement l'hiver de notre vie. Alors c'est toute une description, et ça donne aussi, je pense, à l'auditeur l'inspiration de fermer les yeux et de faire une connexion avec cette musique interne pour l'auditeur lui-même.
Absolument.
So, are you ready, Marc?
Yes. I'll be playing you one quote from Inverno Porteno, which is winter. And interesting enough, Leonid actually mixed some of the seasons. So sometimes he took quotes from another season and put them in another season. So it's kind of interesting that he didn't quite follow exactly which quotes belong to what season. But here's one from the winter of the Four Seasons, and fortunately, this is actually in Piazzolla's Winter. So and so there you have it, like a pretty much direct quote, and then it kind of ends there and goes back into this kind of slow tango feel. I'll give another quote.
Do you want to maybe play a little bit of that tango feel so we can get we can get a preview of what that will sound like?
Sure.
You could just
Absolutely.
choose anywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Right to the beginning. I was carrying my daughter around before I did this, so my arms are like cinder blocks right now. But so that's kind of the tango feel. And you know, if you were to ask me, you know, back in the '90s, you know, could you play something in the tango style on violin? I probably, well, you probably wouldn't be able to find me because the '90s was an awesome time. I would have been out enjoying the '90s. But if you did track me down and ask me that question, I would say, you know, probably not. But you know, since a lot of you know, pretty famed classical musicians like Yo-Yo Ma and Guidon Kramer kind of brought this music, including Daniel Barenboim as well. I think who was actually also from Buenos Aires or spent some time there.
Yes, he spent his youth there.
Yeah, yeah. You know, they kind of like brought it to classical music, or that genre of music. So nowadays, you know, you could say that a lot more classical musicians really understand the tango style, which I think really makes it for a good explanation, you know, kind of the evolving landscape of classical music. One other thing about the quotations here, and this is actually one thing I think is really, really cool, Piazzolla's pianist, Pablo Ziegler, there's actually a quote and actually a sample of one of his solos from the days of the quintet, which I think is really, really awesome. So it's not just the arrangers quotes, but it's actually some direct quotes from the musicians in Piazzolla's band. So I really love that part about it.
There also, cette œuvre est écrite pour, c'est une orchestration pour orchestre à cordes. Il n'y a pas de percussion. Et dans le tango, évidemment, originel, le quintet, il y a toujours des percussions. Et il y a un instrument qui s'appelle le güiro, qui fait une sonore particulièrement raide et caractérise du tango. Et l'arrangeur a donné pour les cordes une façon de jouer, pas sur les cordes exactes comme on doit jouer, mais de jouer de l'autre côté du chevalet pour donner une sonorité comme le güiro. Perhaps you might like to play back of the bridge to give an idea of what this güiro sound is like.
Oh, yeah. So actually a lot of string players I find will play in back of the bridge, and you get a kind of a sound effect like this. And although that's a really, really cool sound, I find it works better on the other side of the bridge because you get a little bit more string length. And what I do is I actually dampen the strings with my left hand. So
that's much better.
It projects a little better. Actually, I remember we did that last summer when we worked together. I was getting the orchestra to kind of play on the other side of the bridge, and gets a much better sound. And actually, this technique I learned from, I believe his name was Mike McDonough. He was actually my high school string orchestra conductor, and he was a big fan of the Turtle Island String Quartet. And in that group, they do this technique a lot. And so I actually learned this from my high school orchestra teacher in Shaker Heights, Ohio. So I kind of credit him for teaching me this skill.
Barbara, let me ask you, do you use percussion techniques in your string writing? Est-ce que vous utilisez des effets percussion dans vos écritures pour les orchestres à cordes?
Yes, I have. Not in Zasakwa, but in other orchestral pieces for sure. I guess I like to rediscover an instrument like a child does, like it's something new and interesting, and what does it actually do? Children do that. We just make sure they don't pick up a very expensive violin, though.
Well, yes, et des fois, on demande des compositeurs contemporains demandent des instrumentistes de jouer, de faire des effets percussion sur la table du violon même avec comment est-ce qu'on dit ça en français? Pas l'archer, ou l'archer, on joue, mais en anglais, c'est the frog. Comment est-ce qu'on dit ça?
Je sais pas.
Julie,
Je sais pas
do
du
you know
tout.
what the frog is in French? It's not pas, c'est pas la froche, but what is it? The frog of the bow.
This would be
You know, Mark, what does it mean in French?
I was just saying this would be useful information for myself as well. When I say start from the frog.
Well, show the frog and we'll know what we're talking about. That's the frog. Yeah. So instead of playing with a bow, you actually hit the instrument or the table of the instrument with a frog. Or play, for example, with the bow on the other side using the wooden part of the bow, either across the string or at the back of the bow. These are all marvelous. Ce sont des techniques merveilleuses, mais pas pour la bonne santé de l'instrument. Et si vous avez un instrument qui date de 1700 quelque chose, comme celui de Marc, c'est quelque chose que vous n'aimez pas vraiment de faire parce que c'est vraiment dangereux. Vous avez une antiquité irréplaçable that's not replaceable. And there, all of a sudden, you have to do all these techniques. So it's challenging for composers. Je dois vous demander, Julie, pour la musique moderne, est-ce qu'il demande des fois des effets vocaux qui vous donnent un défi, comment les produire, qui est pas vraiment, qui fait pas vraiment les choses qu'on apprend quand on apprend le voix?
Oui, absolument. Il y a toutes sortes de trucs qu'on nous demande de faire. Et puis, on n'est pas toujours content non plus. Hein, notre instrument n'est pas toujours content. Mais dans le cas de la pièce de Barb, j'ai dû apprendre à faire le hibou, en fait. Donc,
vraiment, oui.
Oui. Mais ça, c'est bien. Ça va. Ça, c'est agréable. Yes. Mais ouais. Mais non, c'est vrai.
Owl sound, yes.
Oui. Non, mais il y a toutes sortes de trucs, hein, puis des trucs bizarres qu'on doit faire des fois. On fait, OK, bon, il me semble que je n'avais pas vraiment signé pour ça quand j'ai commencé à prendre les cours.
You didn't sign up for that when you studied the course. Yes.
Non, mais on finit toujours par trouver le fun. Mais,
exactement. So, Marc, back to you. You were going to play some Piazzolla, some Vivaldi within Piazzolla.
Right. I'll play another quote, and this one's actually really a lot of fun. And you'll probably recognize this. And then the Vivaldi.
That's autumn. C'est l'automne. C'est la chasse.
Autumn. And,
oui. Mais il décrit avec ça la chasse, hein, les chevaux qui vont à la chasse.
Yeah. And you'll actually find that quote in the spring movement of this Piazzolla Four Seasons, but it's a pretty awesome arrangement of it. It still has the same rhythm, but it's much faster. So it actually incorporates that rhythm, maybe not the same melody, but I think just the act of incorporating the rhythm for that, I think it's really, really cool. It's a little bit more subtle to catch, but the more you play, the more I started playing this piece, some of these quotes started becoming more apparent. And actually, one kind of interesting thing I might add, if there's time, I often like picking up instruments I don't know how to play, like the violin. No, I'm kidding. But one time I actually had the opportunity to pick up something like a bandoneon, an accordion, and actually trying to play the accordion, you realize it takes a little bit of strength just to get the sound going. And I think that kind of really adds to the playing style of Piazzolla's music, because you wouldn't play It's more a punch right at the beginning of the note. So I think that's kind of interesting. And when I play this music, I always try to pretend I'm trying to play an accordion or bandoneon. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about while I play it.
On doit dire en vous écoutant que on s'aperçoit que c'est une œuvre avec beaucoup qui demande beaucoup de techniques violonistiques. C'est une œuvre vraiment virtuose. It's a very virtuosic piece. Barbara, do you think your piece is virtuosic for a singer?
I guess in some sense with the quasi improvisato little episodes where she's almost imagining she's a bird and she's hearing the bird and almost kind of singing back to the bird. So I have these quintuplets with a lot of energy and breaking up the vowels like a bird would sing. So in some sense, yes. I don't have a lot of extended techniques or like barrio or anything like that for sure, but and I guess it's the way I use the text I created, how I break it up. Like for instance, there's one spot which I think is in septuplets, which is an interesting counter rhythm to just the plodding eighth notes. And a lot of her songs are like that. Like you'll have a straight beat, and when I really listen to our traditional singing, it's quite the numeric groupings are quite irregular actually. If you really do listen to our traditional songs, and not just powwow singing, like other types of songs, it's very interesting that way. And I was trying to capture that also. But there's one particular particle in a word, because our words are made up of particles, and it's weiwei, which means vibration or swaying. And she's imagining like the wind swaying the trees with the coming of winter. And I think Julie knows what part I'm talking about, where this weiwei, and it's got this kind of sort of improvised feeling to it of freedom of expression. I like to include that too, so that performers and especially singers feel like they're not boxed into really, very tight rhythms all the time. I really like the balance, just like what Marc is talking about with Piazzolla, and also Piazzolla, and also with Vivaldi. Is there's this? I think classical music has it too. It's just there's this flexibility to work within a rhythm and make it more expressive. Yeah.
Well, il faut dire que la musique classique, je trouve, si on va dans une ligne historique de pré-baroque jusqu'au présent temps, les compositeurs cherchaient toujours to break free of the rhythmic constraints of steady rhythm, and from that early music to rhythm, to our own day, when the desire is to create as much freedom as possible within the rhythms. Just before we finish, one of the things that I listened to us talk about talk shop, if you will, about these various effects within the music. It's very important, I think, for audiences to note that it's very easy to get a paralysis from analysis, de se faire paralyser par l'analyse. Et c'est vraiment pas important au point de vue d'écouter la musique, de savoir que vient tout ça. Ça ajoute peut-être un couleur de connaissance, mais ce n'est pas du tout nécessaire. Je trouve ça la chose magique de la musique. On peut s'asseoir dans une salle de concert ou devant une télévision ou quoi que ce soit, mais maintenant, de nos jours de COVID, et vraiment se mettre dans la musique, to dive into the music in such a way that the music envelops you and you create your own images. And really knowing about it, and whether one is using a technique of this or that or the other, it's really unnecessary to enjoy music. You can know these things, but these things are not absolutely de rigueur de connaître toutes ces choses. So maybe Marc, would you give us another example of the Piazzolla to close us in our conversation today?
Actually, I'd love to give a quote that's not so much a quote, but a direct copy of one of Pablo Ziegler's solos in the original, or later, I should say, Piazzolla Quintet. And this actually would have been performed, interestingly enough, at the Montreal Jazz Festival. I believe it was in the late 70s or early 80s or something. There's a great video on YouTube of it. But this is actually one of the piano solos, which I think is pretty awesome, and I get to play it on violin. So here it is. So that's, yeah, direct, pretty much almost a solo that Pablo Ziegler played in the band version, and I think it's pretty awesome that there's still a lot of original content within this Four Seasons of Buenos Aires. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Alors, j'aimerais remercier de tout cœur Julie Boulianne, Barbara Cole et Marc Djokic pour être des nôtres aujourd'hui, pour donner une indication, un goût, disons, du concert que vous allez entendre dès le 30 sur le réseau de l'Orchestre classique de Montréal, orchestre.ca. Alors, j'espère de vous voir de façon virtuelle chez nous à notre concert, et j'aimerais bien remercier de tout cœur tous mes invités. I'd like to thank all my guests today for helping us find some interesting ideas, and there sure are so many interesting ideas. We could talk forever about what we find in this wonderful music, and we hope that you will all join us on orchestreinfrench.ca to listen to our performance starting at 7:30 on the 30th of March, and for 2 weeks. Once you buy your right to watch it, you can watch it at any time of the night or day that suits you, which is one of the benefits of this virtual age. There are not many benefits of not being there in public, but until we can invite you into the concert hall and be there all together, we have this opportunity to make music together. Alors, je vous remercie de tout cœur et à bientôt. Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.